A black woman, fresh from a grueling business trip and eager to reunite with her family, stepped into the bustling airport, her steps light with the promise of home. But what happened next was far from ordinary. A gate agent, visibly tense, challenged her first-class ticket, her tone laced with condescension, in front of dozens of passengers. This small act of prejudice escalated into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. Just 15 minutes later, a single phone call from her changed everything, leading to consequences that shook the airline industry and sparked a conversation no one could ignore. What unfolded next is a story you don't want to miss. One of dignity, resilience, and the unexpected power of standing your ground. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If this story resonates with you, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more moments of truth that inspire and challenge the way we see the world. It was supposed to be just another routine flight. The morning sun poured through the blinds of the small kitchen, its warmth falling on the stack of unopened mail perched precariously on the counter. Isaiah Moore, a middle-aged black man with deep-set eyes and the kind of hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work, stared at his reflection in the dark surface of his coffee. The aroma was rich, but he hadn't taken a sip yet. His mind was elsewhere, pulled in 100 directions as he prepared for the day ahead. He had always prided himself on being a man of routine. His mornings started with a quiet reflection and a reminder of all the ways he had navigated the world's unseen currents. Those subtle forces that often reminded him that being himself, a black man, required more than resilience, it required precision. Isaiah dressed carefully that day, knowing he was heading into the city for an important meeting with a prospective client. His wife, Ruth, had ironed his shirt the night before, a small gesture of support in a world that often felt indifferent. "You'll define," she'd said, kissing his forehead as she handed him his tie. Her faith in him was unwavering, even when he faltered in his belief that it was enough. The train station was crowded as usual, a mosaic of rushing bodies and fragmented conversations. Isaiah joined the flow, his leather briefcase swinging slightly with each step. The platform was alive with motion, but it was the subtle glances that Isaiah noticed first, flickering eyes that lingered just long enough to make their presence known before darting away. When the train arrived, Isaiah stepped into the first car, scanning for an open seat. Most passengers avoided his gaze, their body language shifting slightly as he walked by. Finally, he found a seat near the window. Across from him, a young white woman clutched her bag a little tighter, her knuckles whitening as if by instinct. Isaiah's eyes didn't linger, but he felt the weight of her discomfort settle around him like a second skin. The rhythm of the train rocked him gently, but his mind remained alert. Isaiah flipped open his notebook, preparing to review his presentation one last time. As he read, he overheard a conversation between two men seated behind him. Their voices were low but clear enough to reach his ears. "First-class clients, huh?" one of them said, a faint chuckle following his words. "You'd think they'd send someone a little more polished. Guess they're going for diversity," the other replied. Isaiah froze, his pen hovering above the page. He didn't turn around. He had learned long ago that such moments were traps, baited with condescension and the false promise of justice in confrontation. Instead, he exhaled slowly, the air leaving his chest with the quiet resolve of someone who had been here before. The train slowed as it approached Isaiah's stop. He gathered his things and stood, deliberately smoothing his tie as if the act itself could fortify him for what was to come. As he exited the car, he felt the weight of those lingering stares, part curiosity, part suspicion, following him onto the platform. The city hummed with life as Isaiah stepped into the streets, the sound of car horns and distant conversations blending into a chaotic symphony. He tightened his grip on his briefcase, his steps steady and deliberate as he approached the office building where his meeting was scheduled. Inside, the air was cooler, the atmosphere quiet and orderly. The receptionist greeted him with a smile that faltered ever so slightly when her eyes met his. Isaiah noticed but said nothing, offering her a polite nod as he signed in. Moments later, he was escorted into a sleek conference room, its walls lined with framed awards and accolades. Across the table sat Martin Caldwell, a senior executive with salt and pepper hair and a handshake that was firm but perfunctory. "Mr. Moore," Caldwell said, gesturing for Isaiah to sit. "Let's get started." The meeting began smoothly enough. Isaiah presented his ideas with the confidence of a man who had honed his craft through years of dedication. But as the minutes passed, he noticed the way Caldwell's gaze shifted. Not to Isaiah, but to the younger associate seated beside him, a man whose responses were eager but inexperienced. When Isaiah finished, Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for your presentation," he said. "I'll admit, I was surprised when I saw your name on the roster for this project. We don't usually bring in outside consultants for something of this scale." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing against Isaiah's chest. He knew what wasn't being said, the unspoken doubt that clung to Caldwell's tone. Isaiah met his gaze evenly, refusing to shrink beneath the implication. "I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Caldwell," Isaiah replied, his voice steady. "I believe my experience speaks for itself. But I'm happy to address any concerns you might have." Caldwell's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll be in touch," he said, rising from his chair. Isaiah nodded, standing to shake his hand once more. The handshake was quick, dismissive, and as he left the room, he couldn't ignore the faint murmur of voices behind him. Outside, the sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the pavement. Isaiah walked with purpose, his mind replaying the events of the meeting in sharp detail. The doubts, the hesitations, the quiet exclusions, they were all threads in a tapestry he had known since he was a boy. By the time he reached the train station for his return trip, Isaiah felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. Yet as he boarded the train, he straightened his shoulders, his grip on his briefcase firm. The world had tested him again, in its subtle, insidious way, but Isaiah knew this wasn't the end of the story. It never was. Each day brought its challenges. And each challenge was a chance to push forward, to carve out space in a world that too often sought to deny it. And so, as the train rumbled forward, Isaiah turned his gaze to the horizon, the setting sun casting a warm glow across the city. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain: he would be ready. The afternoon air was thick with the scent of brewing coffee and the faint musk of freshly printed paper. Isaiah stepped into his small neighborhood cafe, a ritual he often used to unwind before heading home. The cafe was a local institution, run by a cheerful older woman named Dolores, who greeted every customer as if they were family. "Hey there, Mr. Moore," she called from behind the counter, her voice warm and familiar. "The usual?" Isaiah nodded, offering a small smile. "Yes, ma'am." He settled into a corner table, pulling out his notebook to jot down a few ideas that had come to him on the train ride back. The meeting still weighed heavily on his mind, but he was determined to channel his frustration into something productive. As the minutes passed, the cafe began to fill with the hum of conversation. A pair of young professionals seated nearby discussed their upcoming presentation in hushed but animated tones. At another table, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit gestured emphatically while speaking into his phone. Isaiah noticed it all, his mind subconsciously cataloging the scene, the interactions, the subtle hierarchies. It was something he couldn't turn off. This habit of observing the world around him with a mixture of curiosity and guardedness. "Here you go, Mr. Moore," Dolores said, placing a steaming cup of coffee on his table. "On the house today?" Isaiah raised an eyebrow. "What's the occasion?" Dolores grinned. "Just felt like being generous. You looked like you could use a pick-me-up." He chuckled softly. "Thank you, Dolores. I'll take it." He took a sip, savoring the rich flavor, but his moment of respite was interrupted by the sharp chime of the cafe door. A young couple entered, their laughter bright and carefree. The man was white, the woman black, and their presence immediately shifted the atmosphere of the room. Isaiah watched as they approached the counter, their conversation continuing as if the world around them didn't exist. But the world noticed. Dolores greeted them with her usual warmth, but Isaiah saw the flicker of hesitation in her smile, the brief glance she exchanged with her barista. "What can I get for you too?" Dolores asked, her tone slightly more formal than usual. The couple placed their order, oblivious to the subtle shift in the room. As they moved to a table, Isaiah caught snippets of murmured comments from the man in the suit. "Mixed couples," he said, shaking his head as he typed into his phone. "Always trying to prove something." The words weren't directed at anyone in particular. but they landed like a stone in Isaiah's chest. He glanced at the couple, wondering if they had heard, but they seemed engrossed in each other, their laughter rising above the murmur of the room. Isaiah took another sip of his coffee, his thoughts racing. It was a familiar pattern. How quickly a space could turn from welcoming to charge. How the presence of certain bodies disrupted the unspoken rules of comfort for others. His gaze returned to the man in the suit, who was now scrolling through his phone with an air of self-importance. Isaiah debated whether to say something, to confront the man's casual bigotry. But he hesitated. He thought of the meeting earlier that day, of the way silence had often served as both a shield and a prison for him. Dolores broke his train of thought as she approached his table again. This time with a plate of cookies. "For you," she said, setting them down with a smile. Isaiah looked at her, sensing the subtle tension in her posture. "Dolores, can I ask you something?" She tilted her head, curious. "Of course." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "That young couple who just came in, did you feel any kind of pressure serving them?" Dolores blinked, caught off guard by the question. She glanced toward the couple, then back at Isaiah, her smile fading slightly. "Pressure? No, not exactly. Why do you ask?" Isaiah leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Because I noticed how the room changed when they walked in. And I think you did, too." Dolores sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I suppose I did. It's not something I think about. But you're right. People notice. And sometimes, they react. It's not fair. But it happens." Isaiah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And what do you do when it does?" Dolores looked at him for a long moment, then said, "I do what I've always done. I treat everyone the same. As best I can. But it's not always easy." "Isaiah, you know that." He did, too well. As the couple finished their drinks and prepared to leave, Isaiah watched them closely. The man held the door open for the woman, their laughter trailing behind them as they stepped into the afternoon sun. The man in the suit glanced up briefly, his lips curling into a faint sneer before he returned to his phone. Isaiah exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing as the couple disappeared from view. But the questions lingered, heavy and unresolved. When he finally left the cafe, the sky had begun to darken, the first hints of twilight creeping in. As he walked home, he replayed the events of the day in his mind, the quiet moments of resistance and surrender, the choices made and left unmade. The world didn't change in grand gestures, Isaiah reminded himself. It shifted in moments, in small acts of defiance, in the courage to question the unspoken and confront the unseen. He resolved to carry that truth with him, knowing that the road ahead would demand more of him than ever before. But Isaiah Moore was no stranger to demands. He had spent a lifetime meeting them head-on, and he wasn't about to stop now. Isaiah Moore sat at the edge of the conference table, his pen poised over his notebook. The room was a polished arena of corporate professionalism. Sleek glass walls, muted gray carpet, and a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs. Yet, beneath the surface sheen, the atmosphere crackled with tension. This was not the kind of room Isaiah had envisioned when he first entered his profession years ago. He had imagined collaboration, innovation, and a shared drive for excellence. Instead, what he often encountered was a minefield of egos, unspoken biases, and the subtle politics of belonging. "Let's move to the next agenda item," said Michael, the team leader, a man whose voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. Isaiah straightened in his seat, preparing for the topic he'd spent weeks developing, a community outreach initiative aimed at expanding the company's impact in underserved neighborhoods. It was a bold proposal, one that required investment but promised significant returns, both financial and social. "This next initiative comes from Isaiah," Michael announced, his tone neutral. "He's got some interesting ideas for us to consider." Interesting. The word landed with a soft thud, its vagueness deliberate. Isaiah caught the fleeting glance Michael gave him. Polite, distant, and vaguely dismissive. Clearing his throat, Isaiah stood, the room's eyes shifting toward him. He began his presentation with precision, laying out the facts and figures, the potential benefits, and the long-term value of the initiative. As he spoke, he noticed the reactions around the table. Some nodded thoughtfully, others scribbled notes, but a few sat back with folded arms, their expressions guarded. One of them was Charles, a senior executive whose sharp suit and sharper tongue had made him a fixture in the company's upper ranks. "Let me stop you there, Isaiah," Charles interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm not sure this aligns with our core objectives. I mean, it's a nice idea, but it feels a bit off-brand." Isaiah paused, meeting Charles's gaze. "I understand your concern, but I believe this initiative is entirely aligned with our objectives. It's about building trust and loyalty in communities that could become long-term customers." "That's not off-brand, it's forward-thinking." Charles raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Forward-thinking, maybe, but it's also risky. And frankly, I'm not convinced our audience cares about these particular neighborhoods." The words hung in the air like a slow, creeping fog. Isaiah felt the weight of them pressing against his chest. He knew what Charles was implying, even if the man didn't have the courage to say it outright. "Respectfully," Isaiah said, keeping his tone steady, "I think we underestimate our audience if we assume they don't care. People value authenticity and companies that stand for something. This isn't just about those neighborhoods. It's about who we are as a brand." Charles's smirk faded slightly, but his posture remained firm. "I'm just saying we need to be cautious. It's easy to get swept up in ideas that sound good on paper but don't translate in practice." Isaiah nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I appreciate your perspective, Charles, but I've done the research. This isn't just theory. It's backed by data." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Michael glanced between the two men, his discomfort evident. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," he interjected. "Isaiah, your proposal has merit, but perhaps it needs further refinement before we can fully commit." Isaiah forced a smile, nodding. "Of course, I'd be happy to address any specific concerns." Michael didn't respond directly, instead moving the meeting to the next item on the agenda. As the conversation shifted, Isaiah sat back, his mind racing. The coded language, the subtle undermining, it was a pattern he recognized all too well. When the meeting adjourned, Isaiah gathered his materials, his movements deliberate. As he exited the conference room, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Turning, he found himself face to face with Janine, one of the few colleagues he genuinely respected. "You handled that well," she said quietly, her voice laced with both admiration and frustration. "Thanks," Isaiah replied, "but I doubt it made much difference." Janine frowned. "Don't be so sure. You were clear, direct, and unshaken. That counts for something." Isaiah offered a small smile, appreciating her support but unsure how much weight it carried in a room like that. Later that evening, as Isaiah walked home through the dimly lit streets of his neighborhood, he replayed the day's events in his mind. The meeting had been a microcosm of his experiences, a delicate dance of proving himself while navigating the unspoken barriers that always seemed to reappear. He stopped at a corner store to pick up a few items, the familiarity of the space a welcome reprieve. As he approached the counter, the clerk, a young man in his early 20s, smiled warmly. "How's it going, Mr. Moore?" Isaiah smiled back. "Not bad, David. How about you?" David shrugged. "Same old. You know how it is." Isaiah nodded, pulling out his wallet. "Yeah, I know." As he paid for his items, he noticed a flyer taped to the counter. It advertised a local town hall meeting focused on community development. "You going to this?" Isaiah asked, gesturing to the flyer. David shook his head. "Nah, I don't think it'll make a difference. Those meetings are all talk, no action." Isaiah considered his words, then said, "Change doesn't happen overnight, but it doesn't happen at all if we don't show up." David looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "You're right, maybe I'll check it out." As Isaiah stepped back onto the street, he felt a flicker of hope amid the frustration. The challenges he faced were exhausting, the barriers relentless, but moments like this, small, quiet victories, reminded him why he kept fighting. Because change, however slow, was worth the struggle, and Isaiah Moore wasn't about to stop now. The morning came with its usual rituals, coffee brewed to perfection, the low murmur of NPR in the background, and Isaiah Moore flipping through emails at his kitchen table. Outside, the city stirred awake, garbage trucks rattling through narrow streets, the distant wail of sirens cutting through the hum of early traffic. Isaiah's day, however, began with an unexpected note. An email from Michael's assistant sat at the top of his inbox. The subject line was blunt: "Follow up on yesterday's meeting." Isaiah clicked it open, the text short and clinical. Isaiah. Michael has decided to move forward with a revised version of the community outreach proposal. He'd like to workshop it with Charles before presenting it to the senior leadership team. Isaiah read the lines twice, the meaning sinking in with each pass. His proposal, his vision, was being co-opted, handed over to the man who had dismissed it outright in the meeting. His stomach tightened, but his face remained impassive. He had learned to expect these maneuvers. The subtle ways power was wielded in rooms where he was seen but not fully regarded. The office buzzed with its usual energy when Isaiah arrived. Co-workers exchanging pleasantries over coffee and leaning into small, conspiratorial huddles. It was a world that thrived on appearances, on the sheen of camaraderie that often masked unspoken hierarchies. Isaiah found his desk piled with documents and a sticky note scribbled with the words, "Charles wants to see you. ASAP." He grabbed his notepad and walked toward the corner office. Each step a reminder of the careful balance he had to maintain. The weight of expectation pressed against his chest. But he kept his stride steady. When he entered, Charles was already seated, a faint smirk on his face. He gestured for Isaiah to sit. "I've been reviewing your proposal," Charles began, leaning back in his chair. "There's potential here, but it needs some refinement." Isaiah kept his expression neutral, waiting for the inevitable pivot. "I think we need to reposition the messaging," Charles continued, "to appeal to a broader demographic. Right now, it feels too targeted." "Too targeted?" Isaiah repeated, his voice calm but pointed. Charles waved a hand dismissively. "You know what I mean. We don't want to alienate anyone by focusing too much on specific neighborhoods." Isaiah's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what Charles meant, though the man avoided saying it outright. The communities Isaiah had highlighted were predominantly Black and Latino, areas that had long been ignored by corporations like theirs. To Charles, these communities weren't broad enough to justify investment. "With respect," Isaiah said, his tone measured, "the specificity is the strength of this proposal. These neighborhoods represent untapped potential. Ignoring them isn't just a missed opportunity. It's a failure of our responsibility as a company." Charles leaned forward, his smirk fading. "Responsibility is a fine sentiment, Isaiah, but it doesn't drive profits. We're in the business of returns, not charity." Isaiah met his gaze steadily, refusing to flinch. "It's not charity. It's a strategy. People invest in brands that stand for something." The tension in the room thickened, the air between them crackling with unspoken defiance. Finally, Charles leaned back, his smirk returning. "We'll see," he said, his tone dismissive. "Michael and I will workshop this further. I'll let you know if we need anything else." The meeting was over. Isaiah stood, his hands steady despite the storm of frustration building within him. He nodded curtly and left the office, the door clicking softly behind him. By lunchtime, the weight of the morning's events lingered like a shadow. Isaiah found himself at the local cafe, a quiet spot he often retreated to when the office became too stifling. As he stirred his coffee absently, he overheard a conversation at the next table. "I told him we needed a face for the campaign," a man said, his voice dripping with confidence. "Someone who looks like they care. You know, but not too much. It has to feel authentic." Isaiah turned slightly, catching sight of two young professionals engrossed in their conversation. They were discussing a marketing project, their tone casual but tinged with a kind of detached arrogance. "Yeah," the other man replied, "diversity is great and all, but it has to be the right kind. You know what I mean?" Isaiah's grip tightened on his cup, the words igniting a slow burn in his chest. He had heard this sentiment too many times. Diversity as a buzzword, inclusion as a performance. It was the same mentality Charles embodied, the same silent rules that dictated who was deemed worthy and who was not. He wanted to say something, to disrupt their smug conversation with a sharp dose of reality. But he held back, knowing the futility of confronting them here, at this moment. Instead, he pulled out his notebook, jotting down thoughts that came to him in the silence of his frustration. Back at the office, Isaiah found a moment of respite when Janine stopped by his desk. "Lunch today?" she asked, a knowing look in her eyes. "Already ate," he replied, "but thanks." She lingered, sensing the weight he carried. "You know, you don't have to fight these battles alone." Isaiah smiled faintly. "Feels like I do sometimes." Janine shook her head. You don't. And even if it does, you're still standing. That counts for something. Her words settled over him like a bomb. Soothing but fleeting. Isaiah nodded, grateful for her presence even as he prepared for the next round of unspoken battles. The day wore on, the small slights accumulating like raindrops in a storm. Each moment was a reminder of the unspoken rules Isaiah had learned to navigate. The ways his ideas were scrutinized, his presence questioned, his worth subtly diminished. But beneath the surface, something else was building, a quiet resolve. Isaiah knew these challenges weren't new, but he also knew they weren't insurmountable. Because every step forward, every small victory, every unflinching stand in the face of dismissal was a crack in the foundation of a system that thrived on exclusion. And Isaiah Moore was determined to keep cracking it, one quiet act of defiance at a time. Isaiah Moore sat at his desk as the late afternoon light filtered through the narrow blinds, painting the walls with faint golden stripes. His workspace, meticulously organized, betrayed no sign of the turmoil simmering within him. He had spent the better part of the day responding to emails, reviewing proposals, and keeping his head down. A quiet rebellion against the mounting injustices that had become routine. But routine, he knew, was a dangerous thing. It dulled the edges of indignation, lulling even the sharpest minds into complacency. The quiet in the office was broken by the sharp click of heels on tile. Janine appeared in the doorway, her expression tight but sympathetic. "Michael wants to see you," she said, her voice low. Isaiah didn't need to ask why. He nodded, rising from his chair. He adjusted his tie, the act a small reminder to himself to stay composed. As he followed Janine down the hallway, his mind turned over the possibilities. The email about his proposal being workshopped by Charles had been bad enough. This meeting could only mean more complications. Michael's office was a shrine to corporate ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, while sleek, minimalist furniture hinted at power without ostentation. Michael himself, seated behind a massive glass desk, exuded the easy confidence of a man who rarely had to defend his decisions. "Isaiah," he said warmly, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Come in." Isaiah sat, his posture straight but not stiff. He folded his hands on his lap, waiting for Michael to speak. "I wanted to touch base about your proposal," Michael began, leaning forward slightly. "Charles has been working on some revisions. We think there's potential to expand its scope." Isaiah's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "Expand its scope?" he repeated, keeping his tone neutral. "Yes," Michael said, smiling. "We're considering broadening the target audience. The communities you highlighted are important, of course. But we want to ensure the initiative has universal appeal." The words landed like small, precise cuts. Universal appeal was corporate shorthand for erasure. An excuse to dilute initiatives that centered marginalized communities in favor of something more palatable to the mainstream. "I see," Isaiah said, his voice measured. "But the specificity of the proposal is what gives it strength. Broadening the focus risks losing the impact." Michael nodded, his expression one of practiced understanding. "I hear you," he said, the phrase as hollow as a bell. "But we have to balance impact with feasibility. And to be frank, there's some concern about how certain stakeholders might perceive an initiative that's so targeted." Isaiah didn't flinch, though the words hit their mark. He knew what Michael meant by stakeholders. The investors and board members who saw diversity as a marketing tool, not a moral imperative. The people who preferred their inclusion campaigns to be sanitized and uncontroversial. "Respectfully, Michael," Isaiah said, his voice steady, "this isn't about perception. It's about addressing real needs in communities that have been overlooked for far too long. If we dilute the proposal, we risk perpetuating the very inequities we're trying to address." Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the office was silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. "Isaiah," Michael said finally, his tone soft but firm, "I appreciate your passion, I really do. But in this organization, we have to think pragmatically. And pragmatism sometimes means compromise." The meeting ended with no resolution, only the lingering taste of frustration. Isaiah returned to his desk, his mind buzzing with unspoken arguments. He opened his laptop, staring at the proposal on the screen. The words he had crafted so carefully felt fragile now. as if they might shatter under the weight of bureaucratic indifference. Janine appeared again, a coffee cup in hand. She set it on his desk without a word, her presence a quiet act of solidarity. "Thanks," Isaiah said, his voice low. She nodded. "You're not alone in this," she said softly. "Don't forget that." Isaiah nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed her. The battles he faced often felt solitaire, even when others were watching. That evening, as Isaiah walked home, the city seemed sharper than usual. The honking of car horns, the chatter of pedestrians, the flashing lights of billboards, all of it pressed against him. A cacophony of reminders that the world moved on regardless of his struggles. He passed a corner store, its windows plastered with advertisements for products promising a better life. A young black boy stood outside, his face pressed against the glass as he admired a pair of sneakers displayed inside. His mother, standing nearby, called him softly, her tone both gentle and weary. Isaiah paused, watching the scene unfold. The boy hesitated, casting one last longing glance at the sneakers before turning to follow his mother. The sight stirred something in Isaiah, a reminder of why he fought, why he endured the silent battles of the boardroom. It wasn't just about him. It was about the boy and his mother, about all the people who lived with the weight of systemic inequities every day. It was about creating ripples in a system that thrived on silence and compliance. By the time Isaiah reached his apartment, his resolve had solidified. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and began revising his proposal. Not to appease Michael or Charles, but to make it stronger, more undeniable. Each word he typed was an act of defiance, a refusal to let the silent rules of the game dictate his vision. And as the night deepened, the city outside his window a blur of lights and shadows, Isaiah felt a quiet determination take root. The challenges would grow, he knew, the tension would escalate, but he was ready, because for every obstacle they placed in his path, he would find a way to rise above it. Isaiah Moore wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for the world he wanted to leave behind, for the ripples that might one day become waves. The room felt smaller than it was, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Isaiah stood at the front of the conference room, his presentation displayed on the sleek screen behind him. The faces staring back at him were a mix of carefully neutral expressions, faint skepticism, and a few glimmers of genuine interest. This was the moment he had prepared for. But as the meeting began, it was clear the stakes were higher than he had anticipated. Isaiah's latest proposal, a bold initiative to invest directly in underserved black communities, had made waves. It wasn't just the scope of the project, it was the language he used. Words like equity, justice, and reparative made some of his colleagues shift uncomfortably in their seats. They weren't accustomed to hearing these words in the polished halls of corporate America, where sanitized terms like inclusion and diversity were the preferred vernacular. "Thank you all for being here," Isaiah began, his voice steady. "This initiative represents not just an opportunity to make a meaningful impact but a responsibility to address the systemic barriers that continue to disadvantage black communities." He clicked to the next slide, revealing a series of statistics that painted a stark picture of economic inequality. His gaze swept the room, noting the subtle shifts in body language, the crossed arms, the slight narrowing of eyes, the tapping of pens against notepads. These were the signs he had come to recognize, the silent resistance cloaked in professionalism. "Let's be clear," Isaiah continued, "this isn't about charity. It's about recognizing that our success as a company is intrinsically tied to the communities we serve. And for too long, we've overlooked the contributions and potential of black communities." Across the table, Charles leaned forward. He was one of the senior executives, a man whose polished demeanor masked a penchant for subtle sabotage. Charles cleared his throat, his expression one of practiced concern. "Isaiah," he began, his tone measured, "I appreciate your passion for this project. But I wonder if we might be overcomplicating things. Is it necessary to focus so narrowly on one demographic? Wouldn't it be more effective to cast a wider net?" Isaiah had expected this. He took a breath, letting the moment stretch just long enough to gather his thoughts. "With respect, Charles," he said, meeting the older man's gaze directly, "the data speaks for itself. Black communities face specific challenges that require targeted solutions. Diluting the focus of this initiative would undermine its effectiveness." Charles smiled faintly. The kind of smile that said he wasn't convinced but wasn't ready to argue further. "I understand your perspective," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But I think we need to ensure we're not alienating other stakeholders." Stakeholders. That word again. It was the corporate shield for those who feared change, who worried that centering marginalized voices might unsettle the status quo. The conversation shifted as others chimed in, some offering cautious support, others echoing Charles's concerns in softer tones. The meeting became a battleground of competing priorities, each comment carefully calibrated to avoid overt conflict while still pushing back against Isaiah's vision. Through it all, Isaiah held his ground. He answered questions, countered objections, and refused to let the skepticism in the room derail him. But the strain began to show. His voice remained steady, but his hands tightened slightly around the edge of the table. He could feel the weight of their gaze, the unspoken challenge embedded in every nod and raised eyebrow. By the time the meeting ended, Isaiah was both exhausted and resolute. He gathered his materials, nodding politely as colleagues offered vague platitudes about next steps and further discussion. He knew what those phrases meant: delays, compromises, and the slow erosion of his proposal until it was little more than a shadow of its original form. As he walked back to his office, his mind churned with frustration. He thought of the boy outside the corner store, the families struggling to make ends meet, the dreams deferred by generations of systemic inequity. Those were the stakes, and he couldn't afford to let them be ignored. Later that evening, Isaiah found himself at his favorite coffee shop, a quiet place tucked into a corner of the neighborhood where he had grown up. The walls were lined with local art, and the air was rich with the scent of freshly brewed coffee. It was here, surrounded by reminders of the community he was fighting for, that he found the clarity he needed. He opened his laptop, reviewing the notes from the meeting. Every objection, every hesitation, was a marker of the work still to be done. He began drafting a follow-up strategy, refining his arguments and preparing for the next round of discussions. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As Isaiah worked, a group of young people entered the shop, their laughter filling the space. They reminded him of himself at their age, full of ambition and possibility, but also aware of the hurdles that awaited them. He watched them for a moment, their energy and optimism a quiet source of strength. Isaiah returned to his laptop, his resolve unshaken. The room at headquarters might have felt heavy with resistance, but here, surrounded by the vibrant pulse of his community, he remembered why he fought. This wasn't about pleasing stakeholders or navigating office politics. It was about creating a world where those young people could walk into any room, any space, and know they belonged. And with that thought, Isaiah began typing again, his determination as unyielding as ever. The streets were quiet as Isaiah walked home that evening, his breath visible in the cold night air. The faint hum of the city wrapped around him like a second skin. Familiar yet distant, the echo of the day's meeting lingered, each conversation playing on a loop in his mind. It wasn't the overt pushback that troubled him. It was the subtle ways the resistance had been dressed in civility, cloaked in reasonableness, and served with a smile. He knew the game well. He'd seen it played in classrooms, boardrooms, and neighborhood meetings. The pattern was always the same, the insistence on wider perspectives, the calls for patience, the veiled suggestions that urgency was misplaced or unwise. These weren't new battles, but they were battles nonetheless. And they were exhausting. Isaiah stopped at a small park a few blocks from his apartment. The benches were empty, and the swing set creaked faintly in the breeze. He sat down, his hands resting on his knees, and let the stillness settle over him. He thought of his father, a man of few words but boundless wisdom, who had taught him how to navigate these moments. "You don't need to match their pace," his father had said once. "They'll try to slow you down, make you second-guess yourself. But you keep your eyes on where you're going, not where they want you to stay." Those words had carried Isaiah through countless moments of doubt. And tonight, they felt like a lifeline. The next morning, Isaiah arrived at the office earlier than usual. The building was quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. He sat at his desk, pulling up the proposal on his computer. Every word, every statistic, had been carefully chosen, but he knew it wasn't enough. The truth rarely was. He needed more, something that would force his colleagues to see beyond their comfortable detachment. By mid-morning, the office had come alive. the air buzzing with the rhythm of a new workday. Isaiah's assistant, Carmen, knocked lightly on his door and stepped in. "Morning," she said, placing a cup of coffee on his desk. "You okay? You seemed distracted yesterday." Isaiah looked up, offering a faint smile. "Just thinking about how to get through to them." Carmen nodded knowingly. She had seen him wrestle with these battles before. "You got the data, the plan. What's missing?" Isaiah hesitated, then said, "They don't see the people. It's all numbers to them. Abstractions. They can argue with statistics. But it's harder to argue with a face." Carmen tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "So, show them the faces. Bring the people into the room. Even if it's just their stories." Later that afternoon, Isaiah walked into the company's media archives. A small room tucked away on the building's lower level. It was filled with dusty boxes, old photographs, and reels of forgotten footage from the company's past projects. He sifted through the piles, searching for something that could bridge the gap between statistics and humanity. Hours later, he emerged with a handful of photographs and a short film reel from a community project the company had funded years ago. The images were stark and powerful: children playing in a crumbling park, elders gathered on porches of houses in desperate need of repair, a young woman speaking at a town hall with fire in her eyes. These weren't just faces, they were reminders of what was at stake. At the next meeting, Isaiah began differently. Instead of launching into charts and graphs, he dimmed the lights and played the reel. The grainy footage filled the room, each frame a window into lives shaped by the very inequities his proposal sought to address. The room grew still, the usual undercurrent of whispers and side conversations replaced by a heavy, uneasy silence. When the reel ended, Isaiah spoke. "These are the people behind the numbers," he said, his voice steady but charged. "They're not hypothetical, they're not abstractions, they're real, and they're counting on us to do better." For the first time, Isaiah saw cracks in the veneer of his colleagues' indifference. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others avoided his gaze entirely. But a few leaned forward, their expressions softer, more thoughtful. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a start. As the meeting ended, Charles lingered behind, his usual composure replaced by a faint hesitance. "Isaiah," he said, his tone uncharacteristically subdued, "that was compelling. I'll admit, I hadn't thought about it that way." Isaiah met his gaze, his own expression measured. "That's the problem, Charles. Too many people don't think about it that way until they're forced to." Charles nodded slowly, his brow furrowed. "I'll take another look at your proposal." The rest of the day passed in a blur. But Isaiah felt a shift, subtle yet profound. The barriers weren't gone, but they were weaker, more porous. He thought again of his father's words, of keeping his eyes on where he was going. The path wasn't clear, but it was there, waiting to be forged. That night, Isaiah returned to the same park, the swing set creaking softly in the breeze. He sat on the bench, the weight of the day settling over him. The battles weren't over, and they never would be. But for the first time in a long while, he felt the faint stirrings of hope. The morning air was crisp as Isaiah stood on the steps of City Hall, the towering building casting long shadows across the street. He clutched a folder in his hand, its contents the culmination of weeks of relentless effort. Behind him, a small but determined group of supporters gathered, residents from the neighborhoods his proposal sought to uplift, faces that had become familiar and dear. "Are you ready?" Carmen asked, her voice steady but tinged with anticipation. Isaiah nodded, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. "Ready as I'll ever be." Inside the council chamber, the air was thick with tension. Rows of seats were filled with city officials, business leaders, and community advocates, their faces a tapestry of skepticism, hope, and indifference. At the center of it all was the council president, a sharp-eyed woman whose reputation for maintaining the status quo was well known. As Isaiah took his seat at the presenters' table, he felt the weight of their gazes. This wasn't just about a proposal. It was a battle for recognition, for dignity, for the acknowledgement that the lives of those often dismissed mattered as much as anyone else's. The council president tapped her gavel, calling the room to order. "Mr. Walker," she said, her tone formal, "you have the floor." Isaiah rose, unfolding his prepared notes. He glanced once at the room, at the faces watching him, and then began. His presentation started with data, clear, irrefutable evidence of the disparities plaguing the city. He spoke of crumbling infrastructure in predominantly black neighborhoods, of underfunded schools and over-policed streets. His words were steady, but the air remained heavy. His audience unmoved. Then he shifted, turning on a projector to display the photos and footage he had unearthed. Images of children playing in unsafe parks, of elders speaking out at town halls, of vacant lots that once held thriving businesses filled the screen. The room grew quieter, the weight of these realities pressing down like a storm cloud. These aren't just statistics, Isaiah said, his voice firm but tinged with emotion. These are lives, your constituents, your neighbors. They deserve more than what they've been given. They deserve better. As Isaiah spoke, the tension in the room grew palpable. Some council members shifted in their seats. Others stared at their notes, unwilling to meet his gaze. But among the audience, a murmur began to rise. A quiet hum of agreement, of acknowledgement. It was during the Q&A that the real battle began. Councilmember Russell, a longtime ally of the old guard, leaned forward, his expression condescending. Mr. Walker, while your passion is commendable, these issues are complex. Change takes time. Don't you think you're being idealistic? Isaiah met his gaze, unflinching. Idealism doesn't mean ignoring reality. It means believing we can do better, and holding ourselves accountable when we don't. Russell smirked, but before he could respond, a voice from the back of the room cut through the tension. Tell that to the kids who play in those parks, a woman said, standing. Tell that to the families who can't afford to move to safer neighborhoods. Heads turned as more voices joined hers. Residents standing to share their own experiences, their own frustrations. The ripple Isaiah had started was becoming a wave. The council president banged her gavel, attempting to regain control. Order, she demanded, though her voice wavered slightly. But the wave couldn't be stopped. A young man in a hoodie stood, his voice shaking but resolute. We're not asking for miracles. We're asking for fairness. If you won't listen to us, who will? Isaiah stepped back, letting their voices fill the chamber. He had planted the seed, and now it was taking root. By the end of the session, the room was transformed. The council members, once confident in their ability to dismiss him, were visibly shaken. The council president adjourned the meeting with a promise to review the proposal. An outcome Isaiah knew wouldn't have been possible without the voices that had risen alongside his. Outside, the crowd gathered on the steps of City Hall, their energy electric. Carmen approached Isaiah, her face alight with pride. You did it, she said. Isaiah shook his head. We did it, all of us. He looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people who had been overlooked and dismissed but were now standing tall. Their voices finally heard. This wasn't the end, far from it. There were more battles to fight, more minds to change, but for the first time, Isaiah felt the tide turning. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the city in a warm, golden light, Isaiah allowed himself a moment of quiet hope. The struggle wasn't over, but the fight had begun in earnest. And this time, the ripple would become a wave that no one could ignore.